Hi everyone. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about my approach to recording piano. Let's hop right into it. So first things first, I do happen to have a great piano here in the studio. It's a 1917 Steinway. I bought it in 1988, 34 years ago, and it was in great shape then. It had been newly rebuilt, and I have done work on it since, regulation, stuff like that. And so it's a great piano to record, and I keep it in great shape. My philosophy about recording piano basically comes from my own personal preferences, and that is that I generally tend to record piano for the real sound of the instrument and what it's capable of. So, for instance, this piano has probably the best bass I've ever heard on a piano that's not 9 feet. And it has a great sparkling high end. It's fabulous. So I don't really want to restrict it to record like that tacky, hard sound that you get sometimes from, say, a rock piano. In that case, I would almost prefer to use a sample, but there's nothing like recording a real piano, because a real piano has these interactions that go on within the body of the instrument itself. It has the sound of the hammers, there's 12,000 moving parts, so there's a lot in there that's thumping around, and the strings are all sitting right out there, so they pick up resonances depending on the music itself, and that doesn't happen with a sample. When you play one note and another note, they don't correlate with each other in the same way in the cabinet. So it's a special experience, and also the touch is an amazing part of it. So with that in mind, I try and keep my recordings as true as possible to the actual sound of the piano. My room here is basically designed to be as unobtrusive as possible. I don't really want to be married to the sound of the room, so I've tried to keep it somewhat dampened, but at the same time live enough that it doesn't sound like under cushions sort of a sound. And then we use a convolution reverb, most often altiverb, to actually add a room at the end. A convolution reverb, by the way, is a reverb that's actually sampled from a real room. So altiverb has many, many different kinds of rooms, and also interiors, and even outboard units that they have sampled. And they go in, I used to understand it that they used a starter pistol, but now they sweep with a sine wave. And then they take the original sine wave out, and they're actually left with the sound of the room. And then you can do things like change around the microphone arrays that they used. You can have a mono or a stereo mic. So there's a lot of flexibility, and the results are pretty amazing. I have been working as hard as possible to get the best sound out of this piano I can for the last 34 years. When I come into the room and I listen to the sound of the piano, and then I go back into the control room and I listen to the sound of what I'm getting from the microphones, I want those two things to be as close as possible, because the piano is giving me gold. So in pursuit of that, in the old days, I used to rent a microphone. It was kind of it's called a Seducer. It was a pretty terrible microphone. And there were these little strips. They were like PZM mics, and you just set them into the piano. And then when I got some money, I got condenser microphones, and I used KM184s and also 414s. I really don't like 414s on a piano much because they're too thumpy. I even used a kick drum mic for a while on the toe, what I would call the toe of the piano. And that was just to try and get some awesome bass out of it. So I've done a lot of things, moving around in the room, moving the piano around in the room, moving the mics around in relationship to the piano. And what I've finally come up with is using ribbon mics. Now, ribbon mics are kind of special for sounds that might get overbearing. So a great use case for a ribbon microphone would be a trumpet, because a trumpet can be a fairly shrill thing. Even with a great player, ribbon microphone has not quite the extended frequency response of a condenser. And also the element in it is kind of an aluminum, maybe a piece of metal, which moves, and it doesn't vibrate as fast as some of the capsules in condenser microphones. So what that means is that it kind of has a mellower quality to it. And the piano is such a dynamic instrument that it really helps to have something that just takes that punch, takes the transients and just, shaves a little bit off and makes it a little more palatable. My approach with these recordings that I've just done has been to use basically two stereo pairs. And my first stereo pair is a pair of Royer 122s, which are ribbon microphones. Ribbon microphones are generally in figure of 8, almost all of them. And then I'm also using a Townsend Lab Sphere L22, which is a large diaphragm condenser microphone, which is a modeling microphone. It has a great sound on its own, but it also has a software component to it. Actually, the front and rear capsules in the microphone each come through their own connector, and you either need a preamp, like something that has step potentiometer so you can make it the exact same level, or you can use your UAD interface. And UAD is not the only plug-in format it comes in. It also comes in AAX and VST and AU and all that stuff as well. I like to use mine with my UAD system because the latency is pretty low. And there is a plug-in pack that comes with it, and then there are also a couple of plug-in packs for the UAD system which are not available on other systems. One is the Alan Sides collection, which were golden unit microphones that come from Alan Sides' collection. He was the owner of Ocean Way. And at some point before him, the owner of Ocean Way was a man named Bill Putnam, who invented things like the 1176 compressor and the LA2A leveling amplifier. And he had a company which became Universal Audio. His collection is a great one. It's also another pack from UAD. And I used the model of a RCA 44, which was made from 1932 to 1957. So you really can't get them anymore unless you want to pay what you would pay for a car. These are my two stereo pairs, the 122s, the Royer 122s, which are actual ribbon microphones. And then the Sphere, I'm using a single Sphere in stereo mode. And those are my two microphones. Now the Sphere is the distant microphone, quote unquote. I have it about 3.5 feet from the outer edge of the piano, somewhat near the hammers, pointed just into the middle of the strings. And then I have the 122s about a foot from that same outer edge of the piano. They're arrayed in a Blumlein configuration. The microphones, as you can see here, are pointed at one another, but they are 90 degrees from each other, and the spot of the source is in the middle of that 90 degrees, so it bisects it by 45 degrees, I guess. And this is a foolproof way to get phase coherency with that pair of microphones. Now, when something is out of phase, it has kind of a weird sound because the waveforms are canceling each other out. And once you have enough experience, you kind of learn to hear that, but you can also check by summing them into mono. Because we're talking about stereo recording. So if you sum them into mono, two microphones or more are out of phase, you'll hear a noticeable drop in the level and also in the frequency response. So when you're recording stereo sources, you always want to sum them to mono. So with the Royer 122s, which I have in the Blumlein configuration, and with the Sphere, which is a coincident pair, I don't have any danger of having either one of those sources be out of phase with itself. The only thing I have to do is check in mono to make sure that they're not out of phase with each other. Okay, so those are our main microphones. And there's one more microphone, which is an AKG 414 that I have right above the head of the artist so that we can talk in between takes. Now, that 414 may come in handy for other reasons. It has a weirdly boosted bass, which is kind of fun, maybe if you need it. Also, it could be used for parallel compression as well. Now, parallel compression, a lot of times it's used on drums. What you do is you take the drum feed and you send it to a bus, and on that bus you put a compressor and you compress it very, very heavily. To get an idea of what the compressed track alone would sound like, listen to Phil Collins' In the Air Tonight, where the drums come in. That's sort of what it sounds like. It's kind of that sucky sound. I don't mean sucky in a bad way, but it's like, you know, that sort of a sound. Phil Collins uses, in addition to a very heavily compressed sound, a reverse gate. And it was on their talkback microphone. This is, I guess, where I got the idea. I'm just noticing it now. And somebody unmuted the talkback when the drummer was playing, and just all of a sudden it was like, wow. You know, I'm not telling that story exactly correctly, but there was an epiphany moment, and the epiphany moment led to the drum break that, you know, we all know and love. And in that compressor, you use a very fast attack. And what that does is that completely obliterates the transients at the beginning. And so what you get is more the sound of the room and also the sound of the ambiance of the instrument. So with drums, for example, you know, a tom-tom, a bass drum, you know, the rack toms, all that stuff, they have a fairly long decay. Also, piano does too, and a real piano, going back to talking about a real piano and its foibles, a lot of times when you hit something staccato, it still rings. I mean, even the top part of the piano does not have dampers on it. And the dampers don't catch the bass strings as well as they would maybe in a sampled piano. So you can get a lot of interesting information out of a parallel compression. So what you do after you do that is you take the original sound of the drums, the piano, whatever you're parallel compressing, and you take this crushed version of this compressed aux and you mix them together. The compressed aux goes in at a fraction of what the original sound is. And then by muting and unmuting the compressed aux, you'll see what happens. Give it a try. Yeah, there's plenty of videos on parallel compression. I'll do one myself at some point, but it's really magical what you can add. So I have that mic in here, and we just sometimes, you know, sometimes we go with it in the end, but we have it if we need it. So the session that I did last night was with composer Rick Bates. And Rick was here to capture a good piano sound. He's putting together a piece which he recently premiered at Juilliard, which is called Sacred Space. Sacred Space is for solo violin, strings, piano, and percussion. Strings and percussion were already recorded, and we were putting the piano on. So the piano was alone in the room. We had a file with pre-existing instruments already in it, and we were doing overdubs. So we didn't have to worry about any other sound in the room. The piano goes through a lot of different moods. Sometimes it's very sound designy and floaty over top of this percussion stuff. Sometimes it's driving. And so we discussed the possibility when we auditioned the two mics of mixing between the two of them given the musical material at any given moment. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that at the end of the video by just soloing the piano mics and showing you what they sound like. So we're getting there. The last part is the DAW. So In Motu's digital performer, which is what I was using, I have 5 tracks. And those 5 tracks are the 122 left, 122 right, L22 left, L22 right, and then the 414. And I created all of my tracks on the top level. I created 5 takes, so that means I'm looking at 25 tracks. And then I just put them in record as a group. And when I'm finished, I mute them. We may need to listen to them, so if we do, we will listen to them, but after that I mute them so that we can do another take. And the reason for that is because I'm running a cue send into the piano room, and we also have the main mix in the control room. And I want the cue sends to be pre-fader, so that when I move a fader in the control room mix, it doesn't affect the mix that the piano room is listening to. And the reason for that is because in the piano room, as a matter of fact, this happened in the session. The pianist wanted completely different things than we did. She wanted to hear a real loud click. She didn't want to hear a whole lot of the instruments. On the other hand, we wanted to hear it more in context, and we didn't need to hear the click so loud. So if Rick says to me, could we turn down the click a little bit, and I turn it down, and then the click is gone from her feed, for example, that's not what you want. So I know a lot of smart people who do not do it in pre. The disadvantage of pre is that you can mute it in the control room and you won't hear the fact that the talent is still hearing it. So that's why I always mute the tracks instead of just disabling them. Also, it's a lot of small fidgeting. There's a lot to do in a session like that. You have to keep track of what the talent is doing and thinking. You're looking at a score. You have to talk to Rick and see what he wants. You have to turn on the talk back, turn on the microphone that she's using to talk back. You have to turn them off at the right time. There's a lot of things to think about. There's a juggling act going on. So that's my quick down and dirty way to just keep things smooth. Plus, she's a classical musician. And if you saw my video on running a smooth recording session, you'll know what that means. Classical musicians almost always get better as they go on. So I was able to basically provide the finished product by having all the earlier takes muted. Now Rick is going to go through them all, and there'll be spots where he'll pick earlier takes or parts of earlier takes, whatever, but it's almost 90% that what I had unmuted at the end of the session is what will be used. We'll have to get Rick's take on that. See what I did there? As we're ending today, I wanted to listen to 2 sections in the piece. This is just the piano microphones themselves. The first one is a rhythmic driving motive with only the Royer 122s. The second is kind of an ethereal, mellow pan drum kind of a sounding thing, which I'm going to show you the spheres. And then we'll switch it back and forth a little between the 2. So as you can see, this gives us a lot of choices. I hope you learned something from this video and enjoyed it. I hope you'll subscribe. I hope you'll like. I hope you'll ask questions in the comments or tell me how you do these things. It's been a pleasure to hang out with you. Thanks so much.